Dawn arrives like a counterfeit sunrise, a fan of white knives hurled across the misted lowlands where the river has abandoned its banks and turned fields into a soaked anatomy of mud. The Oderbruch lies stretched and vulnerable, a lung that has learned to wheeze. On its far lip, the Seelow Heights lift their tired vertebrae 200 feet of chalk and scrub and trench. A last stern teacher before the city that has set history's teeth on edge. Floodlights borrow light from nowhere and pour it outward, making night confess in pallor. The beams strike the fog and throw it back, a bright snow of blindness that erases edges and promises to reveal while it conceals. You are warned in this theater. Illumination can be another word for confusion. Across the flat, engines breathe like animals preparing for the long haul. The medium shape that has followed every road west for 4 years crouches in the drizzle's slow dawn. Broad tracks, a turret that swivels with the impatience of a boxer's shoulder. The T-34 is not new anymore. It is a veteran's face, wide set and work creased, carrying the memory of winters and steppes like a second layer of metal. It is the archetype of endurance. The communal will given track and gun, the iron peasant. Beside it, heavier profiles loom IS-2s with turrets like clenched knuckles, barrels long as ultimatums. These are not wolves. These are hammers carried by a state that has learned to swing with both hands. When you meet one at the mouth of a village stream, you understand that metaphors can be. Artillery begins with the patience of storm. The earth near Kustrin shudders and then opens. Thousands of throats speaking in one forced choir. Katyusha and racks splatter their shrieks into the wet air. A savage xylophone that plays the same simple melody until even stone learns it. The first Belarusian front writes its sentence on the floodplain with explosives for punctuation. And the Seelow Heights answer the way rockets whose rain they absorb. They chip. They wait. On the crest, the defenders of Ninth Army race behind emplacements that smell of cold stone. Coffee made from something that isn't coffee, in fear that has been disciplined into it. There are Pakfronts cited like bad news. Trench lines knotted into a hillside that has memorized trajectories. And men whose faces have the gray of March and the harsh gray of late decisions. Models Maxim is a ghost in their ears. No gaps. No gifts. A city has been promised. A gate demands a toll. The floodlights sweep again. A field of white pretending to be morning. The light hits fog and the fog blooms. And in the bloom, illusions grow legs. Tanks mistake ditches for roads and roads for reflections of roads. Infantry step into water that speaks the working man's language and rises over boot rims, sliding inside clothing with a cold persuasion that will not be argued with. The T-34s advance not in parade, but in agrarian grind. Track bites filling with clay that wants to become a hand. When the first shells come off the ridge, the logic of height announces itself. The Pakfront bites low into the floats and the wedges. And every yard gained is paid for with a handful of minutes that cannot be earned back. You, standing behind the shield of distance, believe a hammer should break a wall. The wall answers that it has grown used to hammers. IS-2s test the grammar of the heights with 122mm insistence. Each round moves like a decision the council has already made. Each impact folds an embrasure into a rumor and puts fire inside dugouts where map pins once had names. The recoil punches mud off track guards. Crews keep their heads at windows of steel, mouths dry as if the air has a price. They are archetypes of resolve, machines built for endgame, the chess piece that does not move with grace, but ends arguments by occupying the square where arguments used to live. Their slow reload is a penance willingly paid. The next word from that barrel will be the last word in a certain room. Between bridge and floodplain lies the man-made swamp of defense belts of mines seated like self-jurors. Anti-tank ditches cut as if by a god with a grudge. Wire glistening with meaningless dew. Engineers move as if memorizing a prayer probe. Cut. Mark. Repeat white tape unfurling across the ground. A straight sentence through a paragraph that does not want to be read. They carry the ritual of passage stitched into their sleeves. Without them, the T-34 is only a hard-working wish. With them, it becomes an instrument. A mine pops with a noise that has no right to be small. A sapper's body answers gravity with the quiet that follows punctuation. The floodplain rejects certainty. Wheels sink where tracks might float. Tracks float where men will drown. Assault boats nose into slime and lift out of it, studded with reeds like creatures of a bad dream. Searchlights attempt generosity and contribute chaos. The fog breaks and reforms. A thinking substance. On the ridge, guns with sober barrels hold their breath and then exhale at precisely the range where a gunner's pupil becomes a measured unit. The shells stitch their own lattice work across the lights. There is a justice in elevation that is less than human and more than chance. You were told that numbers guarantee. The ridge reminds that equations are incomplete without terrain. At the edge of the high ground, anti-tank guns in camouflage that has learned subtlety pop like black seeds. The angle of the T-34's cheeks was designed for a different century's math, but the slope still speaks, deflecting, complaining, sometimes failing exactly where experience foretells. When rounds slap the turret ring, crews search for the ancient animal inside trained reflex. A hatch opens, a body becomes smoke in a second. Another vehicle shoulders into the same space with the indifference of duty. The IS-2s deliberately crush hedges, farm walls, the symbols of property that an empire now treats as spare parts in a larger mechanism. Their barrels drill into trenches like miners who have learned to hate daylight. The boom is not a sound, it is a subtraction. Somewhere down in the cut ground, a platoon creeps behind the tail of a tank like children behind a parent who can neither hear nor promise. Panzerfausts appear at bad angles, like Sin Short, quick, and ruinously intimate, blossoming into lung-searing orange that writes new gaps in medium armor and leaves a taste of metal between molars miles back. The T-34 represents the collective. The Panzerfaust represents the individual's last argument. Archetypes wrestle in the fog. A tank carries the weight of a country's industrial patience. A man with a tube carries the concentrated bitterness of a lost decade. Which one are you? When the noise becomes a wall and the wall moves, the heights stare down with hard pedagogy. They teach that victory without slope is a lie. They teach that searchlights can make a day of chalk and breath, and that the same light can strip a formation of its depth. They teach that the modern will is an assembly of humble parts, pontoons folded like hymns, fascines rolled like hay, white tape, black coffee, a pencil touching a map as if to bless it. They teach that morale is a riverbed. It looks like a line on paper. It feels like a season in the bones. Those who defend, despite knowing the ending printed on the calendar, aim and reload, and discover that ritual can stand in for hope until hope returns dressed as resignation. The first crest line breaks under the weight of method, not by gallop, not by prophecy, but by the multiplication of modest competences. A T-34 crawls into a scrape on the forward slope and exerts pressure on a field that cannot ignore it. An IS-2 places a round into a house that had been borrowed by a gun and returns the house to silence. Mortars learn the rhythm of a particular ravine. A radio net that was shouting at dawn begins to speak in ordered intervals. You can smell the tide turning cordite and wet chalk and oil warmed by the touch of men who have no time to be gentle. Behind the problem, the city waits like a sentence with a famous name. Every meter's price is taken in advance by a place that has taught nations to speak too loudly. The heights are its vestibule, a psychology of entry. The T-34s are the tradition that has arrived to collect. The IS-2s are the auditors. The defenders on the ridge are the last men of an exhausted thesis, forced to argue for footnotes as if they were axioms. In the white floodlight haze, each muzzle flash becomes a confession. You watch, and if your heart is honest, you feel it split along the seam where duty and pity fall into different languages. The day refuses to finish quickly. The floodlight trick useful in the plan, treacherous in execution, has made heroism clumsy and endurance twice as costly. But the sledgehammer keeps swinging, not as a romantic gesture, but as a schedule. A second echelon bulks behind the first. The lowlands grow tracks like calligraphy. The ridge accepts that there are more hands on this hammer than there are braces in its bone. The ground remembers every army it has carried and quickens its contempt for sentiment. The first anti-tank ditch receives its bridge with a sound that is half metal, half relief. Across it goes the archetype of the age. The tank as community, and beside it, the tank as judgment. As the slope yields a shoulder and the shoulder becomes a corridor, the narrative moves forward by inches that feel like verdicts. Searchlights go off. Dawn arrives for real, a poor, gray thing compared to the electric lie, but honest enough for gunners to adjust to. The ridge withdraws not in feet, but in meanings. And beyond this, without fanfare, lies the outer moat of the city whose stones have written too many oaths. The hammer lifts again. The wolf bares its teeth and lowers its head. You take a breath, because breath is the only wealth that cannot be requisitioned. The Seelow Heights continue to tutor with blows. Mid-morning sketches its reluctant line across the fog that pretended to be daylight and finally conceded to the real thing. The floodplain gleams like a cauterized moon. The heights show their ribs, where the whitewash of searchlights had made shadows treacherous. The natural gray now makes everything precise and unforgiving. The first belt has been chewed and swallowed in pieces, mine tape fluttering like exhausted flags. Bridge layers crouch like beetles over anti-tank ditches. Reed beds trample over ground confession. Tanks stand in shallow scoops. Steel chests heaving from the effort of mud and recoil. Men in quilted jackets move in files that imitate patience. The only virtue terrain respects. The archetypes settle into their stations. The T-34 assumes once more the burden of ubiquity. The way bread accepts butter and the day accepts noise. The IS-2 occupies the role of blunt oracle, speaking rarely loudly, a sentence that ends things. The ridge has prepared a second lesson. Guns tucked into slits of chalk open with a confidence that belongs to distances measured the night before. Pak-40s draw straight lines into targets that never get the chance to be abstract. In 88, the barn doorway edits a field with the same authority a schoolmaster brings to a misbehaving row. Needlewerfers unroll their grief into the air, 7 throats at a time, the notes descending like ill omens. What had been an ideal hole becomes anatomy trig points, pre-sighted stumps, range stakes set by men who no longer need be told that numbers can love them back. You, who prefer the sweep of arrows, are forced to admit that victory happens on the scale of stubble and shoe nails. Assault guns with patient snouts, Su-76, light as shrugging, Su-152's heaviest prophecies lead into the argument. The light ones tap at flanks, hubcaps of fire bouncing down trench lines. The heavy ones deliver to farmsteads that imagine themselves outside of history. The IS-2s spend their long runs as if spending were a civic right loader's shoulders, bruised by the grammar of 122mm. Commander's knuckles whitened on the cupola rim. Gunner's eye a metronome ticking between breath and hand. Their shells land in the snow. A part of the ridge forgets its name. When the barrels lift to meet flashes at the sky, the day becomes a duel between horizons. The defenders' faces are carved from a syllabus of labor exhaustion. Some wear the hard cheekbones of men who have eaten ration and resolved for too long. Somewhere the ragged youth in uniform so much contracts who should be thinking about girls and tractors. Not about the silhouette of a turret. In slit trenches, Volkssturm armbands glow the color of defiance painted over doubt. A Feldwebel walks the line as if memorizing a poem that has lost half its stanzas. He places a hand on a paw breech the way a priest places a hand on a patient's brow. When he calls fire, he does not call fate, he calls craft. The Panzerfaust wait in doorways like short, ugly angels, demanding to be kissed, and then flay the mouth that kisses them. Even a god would hesitate at such intimacy. The T-34s know this intimacy too well. One shoulders forward into a culvert, sloughing water like a thing baptized unwillingly, and takes a blossom of flame against the right cheek. The slope tries to argue. The mathematics has moved on. The jet sears into the turret ring and replaces presence with absence. A companion vehicle pulls in as if covering a friend with a coat. The platoon's third makes a long arc through a beat field, scattering the signatures of its tracks like false leads, and trades shells with a gun that knows its own obituary. Communities endure because someone steps into a shape that fate has just erased. You can smell that endurance oil grown hot. Cordite turns sweet like mud. The strange, clean scent of charcoal. Katyushas reach again from the eastern bank. Refuses to die. Their laddered notes slap the hillside and peel away bushes that had lied about being only bushes. The ridge answers with its own choir. Counter battery flashes like nervous hands on the skyline. Between, in the ravines that knot the slope, infantry nose forward, relay by relay, hunched behind the shoulder blades of steel. The archetype called combined arms shows its unromantic face, a sapper's white cape, a machine gun that will not be hurried, a signaler kneeling to shield a handset as if protecting a bird. The day ceases to be about hedges and becomes about integers. Add a squad here, subtract a gun there, divide a company by the width of the ditch, and multiply it by the will of the sun. Midday fog revealed the second crest, and the villages tucked like buttons along the road. Dolgolin, Bulkan, right line behind, and Alt Rosenthal ahead. Their church spires like raised fingers asking for more. The IS-2s nose into streets that used to smell of hay and now taste of plaster. They are too large for gentleness. Gates flatten, wall tops leap into shingles of air. Door frames become fragments of flame. In a kitchen, a teapot lives through the concussion and hums without water. On the sill, a cracked uranium burns pale mouths to dust. The tank's 122 writes a full stop into a house where a machine gun has been conjugating death. The crew hears nothing that is not their own machine. The village hears nothing that it will ever forget. On the ridge, orders change tense. Reserve companies that had been nouns become verbs. A counterattack climbs a lane that goats had once measured. Half a dozen tanks and a sleeve full of infantry rising in a line being still. Turrets low, barrels at a slight, anxious elevation. They crest onto a geometry prepared by strangers. An IS-2 waiting behind a crooked barn takes the first at a quartering angle that mutilates argument. A T-34 across the orchard saws the second with curt 85 mulli syllables. Mortar smoke writes a veil that deceives no one but comforts everyone who has to move under it. The counterattack dissolves into pronouns he, and then into the grammar of red crosses and low voices. Traffic behind the floodplain grows into a parable. Columns tangle at the only firm causeway as if the war itself had tied a knot. A stuck tractor makes 100 tanks late, and lateness becomes a minor god that demands recognition. Staff cars with flags hiss past and are swallowed by the same mud as peasant cars. Priority is a superstition when the ground disagrees. This is how a sledgehammer swings in the real world through grit teeth, through cues, through the civics of patience. You might yearn for clean thrust. The earth prefers core. Afternoon brings clarity that wounds and heals. The clouds retreat enough for observation planes to carve their quiet arcs. The ridgeline's guns, forced to unmask, receive responses that sound like large doors slamming again and again. The IS-2s, no longer blind men hitting a wall for the century, begin to blaze, not just strike. Their barrel smoke drifts like heads that mark a path no map had printed. The T-34 take their own shell bursts with the exuberance of its physics. Short rush, break, swing, fire, and the dance repeats until the grammar of the slope changes mode. Where the flies have been a declarative, it becomes interrogative how long, from which woodline, on the defender's side, ritual. Ammunition runners scramble like thoughts. A platoon leader counts panzer files excuses. A chaplain folds a scarf and ties a tourniquet with the calm that makes courage copy itself. For a heartbeat, a captured Soviet flag flutters from a useless pole. A petty irony in a field that has lost its taste for jokes. A gun crew that has held exactly as long as doctrine demands retires 20 yards in a single slow motion, dragging its piece by stubborn hands in a rope that bites palms. No one sings now. The music is the clack of a breech and the particular concussive cough of a 122 that has found something important to say. By evening, the second crest no longer guarantees sight. What had been a horizon of authority now hosts silhouettes that refuse to remain strangers. The hammer's face shows dense, but its arm is fresh. The anvil chips along edges, and chips matter. A supply truck bogs in a road that seems older than history. A squad pushes with the cheerful malice of the living. The truck climbs out like a beast, humiliated but convinced. Somewhere a T-34 is hit and does not burn. Its crew stunned into the stillness that listens for death and hears only instruction reverse. Left clutch. Smoke. Somewhere an IS-2 inches into a courtyard and drops a round through a doorway. An act so intimate it feels like trespass. Necessary as surgery. Night decides to come the honest way. No floodlights this time. No electric liturgy, just a slow cooling. The ink of the Oder Brook thickening along the ditches. The ridge tapering into a dark that contains sounds like beads on a string, a kettle on a primus, a radio's dry whisper, boots explaining themselves to boards. The heights have not fallen, they have shortened. Between shortened and fallen lies the city's out of breath. A pressure you can feel in your teeth. You are reader of campaigns and consumer of legends. Might crave crescendo. The ground denies crescendo and offers persistence. The archetypes take it. The community in steel, the T-34 has more of itself arriving. The judgment in steel, the IS-2 has enough words left for tomorrow. The Sapper's tape is almost gone from one roll and fresh on another. The defenders tally in smaller numbers and larger sentences. The gate still stands, battered uprights on a hinge that squeals. The sledgehammer is drawn back one more notch, muscles bunching in a collective arm. Far behind, train whistles pretend the world still owns schedules. Far ahead, a dome the color of old bone waits to learn its place. Sleep becomes a contraband traded for minutes and cigarettes. The ridge mutters and the lowland replies. The night smells of wet soil and hot burning grease, and the thin metallic tang that clings to the tongue after a day spent near ruin. Even if the ear surrendered, the bones would continue to listen. There is no truce here, only intermissions. And in intermissions, the audience becomes complicit. You have watched long enough to be an accomplice to inevitability. The next swing will be early. The next belt will be narrower, but wired with expertise. The next village will have laid out its rooms like a puzzle that imagines itself unsolved. Yet the grammar has shifted in a way even rock understands. The ridge, a tutor with a cane, has found its lesson interrupted by a larger voice. The hammer will speak in the gate will answer in its old oak tone. Between them stands the city with its mausoleum gaze and its vault of names. The sledgehammer lifts in the last light and waits. Patient as iron and as impersonal. Breath is hoarded. Hands rest on cold levers as if touching the future through metal. Morning steps in without ceremony. A low bruise of light seeping under the door of the east. Frost lifts in threads from trenched lips and from the cooling skins of machines. Breath plumes from men and exhaust plumes from iron. And the two mingled vapors make a common weather. The ritual begins again, hand across visor, hand across map. The imperative of coffee swallowed like a vow. In the damp hush before the first gun speaks, the floodplain holds its dampened heart, and the ridge waits with the patience of limestone. Then the sledgehammer's preface arrives, a measured thundering, not the frantic percussion of the night before, but a stern grammar of heavy shells setting their periods where commas used to be. The T-34 stirred as if called by their inheritance. Mud cakes their running gear into a second anatomy. Ice clings to handles like stubborn opinions. They fan along lanes stitched by Sapper's tape, white ribbons fluttering above minds that would dearly like to become memory. Engineers move at a crouch that is half professional, half theology, and the shears in their gloved hands are sacraments. Where the anti-tank ditch yawns again, ridge layers squat and extend vertebrae into the cut. Plates clattering like shield edges. A plank of daylight is thrown across denial, and the first medium shapes tested with the indifference of necessity. You would wish for trumpets, the sledgehammer knows only timings. The IS-2s arrive late on purpose. A procession of iron shoulders entering a room that has already been exposed to pain. Frost beads on their mantlets, Muzzle brakes carry last night's smoke as if it were a superstition they refuse to discard. The first 122 falls short against a scarp and throws a shawl of chalk over the nearest trench. The second reaches for a gun slit and pulls it out by its iron throat. Crews count with their bodies, load, ram. Up language inside the turret reduced to syllables. They are archetypes of conclusion, not elegant, not quick, but authorized. The ridge reveals its second skin. Guns placed in slits that pretend to be shadows answer, with the precision stored in cold metal. And the flat crack of the Pak-40 is a schoolmaster's stick correcting misbehavior at the exact range where shame begins. A barn swallows a muzzle flash, then spits, and the first T-34 in a file shudders into stillness as if convinced by a bad argument. Its comrades split their lanes and push. One left into a willow fold, one right along a hedge depression the map had not dignified. The slope's defenders paratroop remnants, training battalions seasoned overnight. Volkssturm in coats older than doctrine handle Panzerfaust like pocket miracles. The miracle is short, its price is long. A boy with a badge stitched crookedly on his sleeve breathes once through his mouth to steady his hands, then vanishes into flame that wants to own the whole alphabet. On this ground, intimacy is a weapon and a debt. Assault guns join the exchange with their differing philosophies. IS-2 152s, those brick-shouldered behemoths, speak syllables that make roofs lose interest in staying roofs. Su-76 patter around the flanks like argumentative cousins, adding notes where the score needs brightness. Infantry moves in the old way with new caution, 4 men to a doorway, 3 to a ditch, 1 to an ear pressed against a handset protected by a helmet like a winter nest. The ideal called combined arms keeps its distance from romance and embraces carpentry ladders, ropes, stakes, mines lifted from soil with patient fingers, wire brushed aside with the tenderness of gardeners who must live in their own work. Midday offers the gift that always costs a higher ceiling. The low cloud thins until it is only a distaste. Il-2s tilt their black wings and comb the slope with rockets and cannon passes that sound like curtains being torn across a large room. A few dark arrows scratch back from the West fighters, hungry for a bargain, but the bargain is poor, and the sky soon resumes its single-minded lesson. The ridge's guns must unmask and reply. When they do, heavy batteries behind the river correct like strict accountants. The dialogue grows rare, the monologue grows steady. A counterstroke climbs from the fold east of a village whose name is already losing syllables to shrapnel half a dozen tanks, and the rigid resolve of men who have been told that holding the next line requires hurting someone at this point. They come in a file that knows better and cannot help itself. Noses dipping at each terrace, long 75s wagging like denial. An IS-2 waiting behind a tilting gable speaks once and replaces the lead vehicle with a study in smoke. A T-34 on the orchard edge talks in shorter sentences and forces the second cat to consider humility. Mortars lay a veil and conspire with confidence. Infantry with captured ears for rhythm slip forward to prune what the armor has felled. The counterstroke breaks into separate men and then into separate gestures, someone dragging someone looking for a rifle that is no longer a tool, but a memory. You are asked without words whether you prefer courage expended or results saved. The ground is distant. Traffic becomes its own battle at the causeway. A broken track on a pontoon is a theater where everyone is an unwilling actor. Recovery trucks rear like geldings. Officers perform arithmetic with their hands. A driver smacks a frozen pin as if it were an unfaithful friend. The delay is not romantic. It is sovereign. A column of guards, tanks, banners rolled. Paint dulled by March miles from east of east arrives with the stoicism of athletes warming a bench, then flows through an opening engineered by swearing and leverage. They are the second wave by design. The iron kept in hand for when the tutor's cane finally cracks. Their arrival changes not the sound, but the temperature. Villages along the ridge keep surrendering their faces. Church spires, those narrow fingers that once declared weather and blessing. break into joints that know the cost of pointing. A schoolroom exhales chalk and children's dust from 30 years ago. A globe rolls to a corner and spins uselessly. A photograph on a mantle smiles in a language the war has not bothered to learn. The IS-2 puts a round through a parlor wall that had hosted birthdays. The T-34 cuts a garden fence that once kept hens from scandal. The infantry finds a cellar lined with jars that survived 3 winters and not this afternoon. Symbols drown in use. Archetypes do not apologize. The defenders drift through the trenches by meters. An 88 is walked backward down a lane, its crew refusing to grant chaos the dignity of a run. A Feldwebel with hollow cheeks counts shells like a miser counting beads of blood. 8 left for this position. 4 for the one behind. A chaplain ties a bandage and tells a man to look at his hand. Not at the sky, because a hand is something you can imagine healing. In a doorway, a Panzerfaust waits again for a silhouette that the afternoon. The shot is clean, the result dirty, and the celebrant coughs for a minute he had not planned to own. The Lowlands chorus answers by persistence. Where a T-34 is kissed by fire and does not ignite. Smoke pots birth gray that opens a side street like a drawn curtain. Where a platoon hesitates at a wall scored by a sniper. A sapper's charge edits the architecture into agreement. Where it lands too narrow for a hammer. The handle goes first infantry, flooding the hinge. Armor following like a verdict. The ground is not won, it is convinced. House by house, lip by lip. Even a ridge with doctrine eventually believes what weight and method chain into its stone. By late afternoon, the second belt resembles a rumor. Its lines exist on paper and in men's discipline. They do not exist in the one place that matters under a boot heel. The third belt announces itself with new wire, trenches that have not yet learned to spare, minds that have not yet been mapped by the dead. Yet the grammar of the day has shifted when the Heights spoke in declarations. They now ask questions: how long this traverse? Which ravine holds? Who mans the reserve? The answer is a layered patience. Guards' tank brigades seep forward on roads that used to be goat tracks. IS-2s stride at village margins like magistrates. T-34s keep the chorus thick enough that no single loss becomes a whole. The city enters as a pressure before it becomes a horizon. The air smells faintly of coal, someone else intended to burn for comfort. The sky carries a brown hush that is not weather. Domes and smokestacks at the very edge of sight create a grammar of silhouette. A ring of rail and road waits like a brace of questions. You are asked again how much steel must speak before stone listens. The answer comes not in metaphors, but in minutes enough minutes to place bridges. Enough to cool barrels and heat food. Enough to keep engines from sulking into silence between blows. Twilight builds itself out of gun flashes. No floodlights now to counterfeit dignity. Only the honest strobing of weapons. The third belt is not yet undone, but its edges fray where the sledgehammer's face has nicked it. The ridge does not fall so much as it grows transparent. Through it, the city's outer sheen gleams like a coin buried in ash. The archetypes can stop. The community in steel remains numerous. The judgment in steel still has breath to spare. The savage wall of tape is replaced by another from a crate that smells of paste and dust. The defenders count by squads where they once counted by companies. A gate, battered, continues to insist on being a gate. A hammer, tired, insists on being swung until the hinge admits it cannot be hinge and wall both. Night proposes parley. Neither side accepts. Work continues in the honest verbs dig, haul, fetch, mark, sleep for 10. The river behind murmurs approval in the language of business. The height ahead loses its lecturing tone. The sledgehammer rests against a knee no single hand owns. You might crave thunder. The men who will make the next dawn prefer instructions. The gates of the city feel nearer in the bones than in the eyes. Under the dark, engines tick and cool. Teeth chatter in code. And prayers are recited without faith and with absolute need. Dawn, when it comes again, no longer pretends to be mysterious. It is a pale technician, carrying a clipboard of cold and a pencil shaved down to discipline. The floodplain has been scored into lanes like a book under study, where the mud once argued with every step. Corduroy roads and fascines now speak in the firm syllables of solved problems. The heights, for all their pride, look thinner, their hedge of guns frayed into single thorns. You can feel it before the guns announce it, the shift from pleading to procedure, from drama to method. The sledgehammer has learned the cadence of the hinge. The medium shapes, those faithful citizens in steel, rise from their shallow scrapes with the unshowy authority of Britain. The T-34s carry yesterday's chalk in their seams, and the river's dry breath in their vents. No one asks them to be beautiful, everyone expects them to be present. Their crews have eyes that have forgotten to be young, and hands that remember everything else. They roll forward at the pace of caution, snouts aligned to lanes that Sapper tape has teased from a field of traps and ghosts. In their wake, the earth admits a truth it hates: repetition as pressure, pressure as fate. The heavier verdicts follow IS-2 shouldering into view like magistrates late to a funeral, faces grim with the knowledge of what the day will require. Their barrels are arguments that don't need persuasion. Each 122mm round is a phrase too large to ignore. Farmsteads that had turned themselves into sentences of defiance collapse into commas and ash. Embrasures that had learned contempt forget their lessons. The hammer's face bears new dents. Its weight remains sure. The ridge answers with what it has saved. A barn sneezes muzzle flash, and a Pak-40 writes a hard black line through a leading turret. An 88 set back under a leaning roof takes the audacity out of a lane. A Panzerfaust from a doorway teaches a final, intimate lesson to a silhouette that could not help being exactly the right size. But the answers arrive singly now, not in chorus, where doctrine once gathered into music. Fatigue has thinned it to scattered notes. You are tempted to pity or to cheer. The ground allows neither. It tolerates only arithmetic. On a terrace cut by old hands and new shell bursts, a counterweight tries to lift half a company of tanks and the double handful of infantry who will run with them to steal an hour. They glide up a stony track that goats owned before nations did. Their long 75s are steady punctuation marks in an argument already decided. An IS-2 hidden by a sagging hedge speaks once and buries the lead vehicle in smoke and flayed steel. Two T-34s rake the second and third with the impatient grammar of 85mm repeating. Mortars stitch a gray curtain around the survivors and invite them to consider leaving their bodies behind. The ridge keeps trying to find a sentence with the word still in it. The hammer keeps erasing the verb. The middle day becomes an inventory of rooms. Villages stitched to the slope. Ailt Rosenthal, Neusorg, names that sound like moods offer their floors and thresholds to the trade. A T-34 noses into a lane and finds it narrowed to a doctrine by a wagon tipped on edge. A wall, a cellar spilled into a street. The driver keeps it straight because 2 inches either way is history's mistake. Infantry swarm past with the efficiency of ants and the hot-blooded care of brothers. A boy with a Panzerfaust appears and disappears into a blaze that teaches both sides the cost of proximity. An IS-2 plants its tracks across a garden and puts a round through a door whose lintel bears a marriage date. A kettle continues to hum in an adjacent room without knowing why. The archetypes refuse to look away. The sky opens just enough to allow punctuation from above. Il-2s fold out of the pale and descend like carpenters' plumb bobs. Tidy and merciless, rockets crawl across terraces, tusks of fire that unteach a gun crew its courage. Flak answers in nervous blossoms, more habit than confidence. When the slope must show its positions to shoot, observers on the far bank write corrections like accountants convinced their columns can outlast passion. The second belt is no longer a line, it is a set of stars. Traffic behind the lowland snarls into another myth, this one true, all elbows and patience. A track thrown on a bridge becomes a sacrament requiring community. Officers hoist and grunt alongside men with no rank and the same urgency. A wrecker coughs like a mule and leans its whole life into the job. A sapper taps a frozen pin with the respectful violence prayer sometimes needs. Under the swearing and breath, the queue begins to move again. Guards tanks first, then the next chorus of T-34s. Then assault guns with the peculiar dignity of anvils that learn to walk. On the crest, reserves that have been adjectives become nouns. Then actions. Training companies who met their rifles last month discover hands can learn languages under fire. Paratroop remnants carry their professionalism like an heirloom and spend it with the sadness of adults. Volkssturm men, coats and wills stitched by wives' fingers, lift weapons that still smell. A Feldwebel sets a new gun line with the calm meditation of a man rearranging furniture in a burning house. He is competent and doomed. And those two facts hold hands a long time in war. His last order is a coordinate. His last look is not toward the city, but toward a comrade who knows where the shells are. By late afternoon, a hum replaces the individual noises. It is not distant, it lives behind the teeth. The third belt acknowledges itself with fresh wire and trenches that have not yet learned grief. The first exchange is rude, the second deliberate. IS-2s, slow-walking magistrates, begin to choose this house, not that, this angle, not the convenient one, this moment, not the impatient one. T-34s flow into gullies and reverse out of certainty, their turrets turning as if nostalgia were a weapon. Sappers pull a post, cut a strand, chalk a lane, and what was impassable becomes simply difficult, which is the beginning of permission. Somewhere along the right, a heavy stick with a square jaw, call it a king. If you need a story, tries to dictate at range from a knuckle of earth. It kills what it looks at. It makes a clearing in thought. The reply is not chivalry. It is smoke lit without hurry. A stalk through ditches. A call on a net that now includes friends rumored for years. Guns big enough to talk back from beyond the riverbank. Aircraft with spare time. A patient IS-2 slipping into a lateral shadow. When the smoke unwinds, the square jaw thing is relaxed. This is how late wars argue, not with grand gestures, but with conspiracies of craft. The defender's ritual grows frail. Ammunition comes up slower than wounds go down. A chaplain learns he has no words left and lends his hands to bandaging instead. Discovering that pity refuels more men than speeches do. A gun crew drags its piece 20 yards and rediscovers survival. An officer holds a telephone that will not consent to voice. He stares at the wire as if loyalty could move along it like current. The ridge's grammar shifts to the future conditional if we had. We would. The hammer speaks in the present imperative, do. Evening pulls the color out of things without muting their meanings. No floodlights this time to make day into chalk. The city's glow under the horizon is its own apology. The third belt has not collapsed. It has conceded breath. The line moves like frost receding from a window, clearing just enough to reveal a skyline that does not deserve its romance water towers. A gasometer's ribcage. A dome in the distance too, knowing for innocence. The outer moat of the city is not water, but will. The men at the ridge feel that moat narrow in their bones. Night hears working more than it hears war. Spades bite, ladders knock, bolts run and tug like washes in a song. A T-34 idles while its crew eats and relays. Tin spoons clinking like private liturgy. An IS-2's loader flexes fingers. The 122's brass remembering every shoulder it has bruised and every room it has simplified. Sappers measure darkness in tape widths. Far back, trains make noises like promises. Far ahead, a few heavy rounds that don't release themselves. You may crave conclusion. The men write continuity. If you need heroes, the day gives you smaller ones than statues require a sapper who refuses to step where even foxes won't. A driver who breathes with his engine and coaxes steel across planks that think they were born. A gunner who holds his shot for the second silhouette because the first is a decoy and the second is a man who believes in decoys. If you need villains, the day proposes hunger, cold, task, and distance. Before sleep, such as it is, the archetypes count themselves. The community in steel has bled and multiplied. Where one burns, two arrive stinking of fuel and intent. The judgment in steel remains slow and unforgiving. An old god with a few thunderbolts left. stands smaller under its own shadow, a teacher who has begun to lose the way. And the city, without speaking, leans closer, its breath coal-dusted and ancient. You, who have followed this long lesson, are invited to stop thinking in banners and start thinking in rooms, corners, stairwells, doors, and the short distances where history turns hand-sized and final. The hinge squeals less now when pushed. The hammer lifts with fewer hands and more certainty. Dawn will not need trickery. The floodlights will stay dark. The day will be lit by brick dust and decisive verbs. Between here and that, dawn lies the last patient night of the ridge. And beyond the ridge, the wide, dense text of streets. If you have prayers, they had better be practical for ladders that do not break, for engines that choose to wait, for hearts that can hold the weight of rooms. Dawn does not argue. It audits. The floodplain holds its ledger open. Columns of corduroy and tape, fascines and repaired bridges, and the ridge, once a stern lecturer, stands uncertain before the page. The guns write a last preface that does not seek to impress measured salvos stepping up the slope like an accountant counting stairs. The medium shapes rise in their lines, T-34 shaking frost from skirts and chalk dust from welds, and move with the plain dignity of workmen returning to a task that has begun to yield under their hands. Their ethos has always been continuity, and continuity becomes conquest when resistance runs out of fresh language. You feel it in your own ribs, the hinge about to admit the weight it has refused. The IS-2s enter like verdicts carried by bailiffs. Their barrels are arguments too heavy to be derailed now. Their mantlets scabbed the day before, and in a first 122 opens a house that has learned hospitality. A second takes the memory out of a gun position that once believed itself permanent. A third reaches higher, to a tree-lined lip where muzzle flashes have flickered like defined eyelids, and removes the eyelids. Reloads are slow rituals, muscular prayers to a god of leverage. Every round laid on the tray is a sentence pressed to the tongue and spoken without poetry. Somewhere, a clock tries to mark seconds. The hammer insists on minutes. The defenders answer, because that is what defenders do when the wall becomes a biography. A barn door cleaves to spit a pack's last clean line, and a T-34 takes it like truth before smoke, and companions edit the sentence. An 88 under a canted roof pushes a hole through a lane so carefully measured that even the dust looks precise. And then heavy shells from across the river visit the roof and persuade it to let go of dignity. Panzerfausts bloom at touching distance, the oldest intimacy the war invented. And for a heartbeat, a medium shape recoils into silence as if ashamed of having offered a silhouette to hunger. Yet the offerings multiply. Where one hush falls, two voices resume. You are forced to respect the arithmetic. Endurance is not eloquence, it is addition. On the crest that had announced itself as geology, men start moving like biographies that have approximated their last page. Reserve companies spill into seams they cannot mend. Training battalions harden in place and then splinter. Paratroop remnants act like memory-given rifles. A Feldwebel walks his 5 remaining guns into a row that would impress a saint and then watches the row evaporate under the slow, patient hail that has replaced flamboyance. He does not bow. He notes a coordinate that no longer maps to anything the earth will remember and steps sideways into the business of saving someone with his hands. The ridge's voice, once declarative, devolves into futureless verbs: hold, fire, fall back, and then into nouns: ammo, stretcher, ditch. Villages tight on the slope change from obstacles into corridors. Alt Rosenthal cedes its first corner, like a tired boxer giving ground to the ropes. New Sorg pretends its name means anything until an IS-2 shoulders into the street and renders semantics irrelevant. The T-34s move with the knowledge of rooms nose angled to a doorway, hull down on a kitchen floor dug by 3 inches, turret hunting for the stairwell angle where a descent starts and a Panzerfaust ends. Infantry inherit the places the hammer cannot fix under stairs, behind ovens, inside wardrobes that conceal 2 lives and a rocket. A kettle survives in a back room and hums as if boiling grease. You tell yourself this is about armies. The stove insists it is about houses. Air permits itself. EL-2s hang like blunt arguments above the belts. Rockets comb terraces into arithmetic mistakes. The ridges flag blooms and wilts. A last botanical metaphor for the day before. Observers task heavy guns by the wearing their trench coats and the steadiness in their elbows. Corrections arrive like the final edits on a manuscript about to go to press. When the slope must reveal itself, it is marked. When it is marked, it is simplified. The third belt, younger than the others, learns in an afternoon what its elders learned at greater length method is a climate, not an event. A counterstroke tries to exist because duty, when it cannot rule, still has to appear. Half a dozen tanks and Seelow infantry rise along a path that looks like a sentence the land had meant to keep. They crest into a geometry. Smoke obliges them to guess badly. An IS-2 speaks from a hedge that looks too thin to hide a verdict and replaces the lead vehicle with a black, persuasive emptiness. Two T-34 saw the flank with Kurt, working shots that sound like a carpenter agreeing with himself. Mortars fold a gray scrim around the remainder. Someone grabs something. The motion shrinks into a single iron shape, abandoned nose in at the wall, and the wall accepts it without ceremony. You might want a duel. The day insists on the craft. Traffic always a second front proves equal to will. A track pin that refused to wake at the causeway finally admits the day its duty. A wrecker's boom groans like an old hymn, and the stuck thing becomes a moving one. The queue flows. Guards tanks first with banners, folded tight against weather and superstition. Then the rest of the chorus. Bridges that dreamed of lighter lives accept a weight, and their rivets do not complain. The hammer's handle, made of engineers and ordnance, and drivers who breathe in time with their machines, holds. By midday, the ridge stops pretending to be a place and becomes a process, a narrowing, a thinness, a series of gestures that cannot keep up with the hands that make them. The long view, once a weapon, becomes a confession, and in that confession, the city outlines itself. A gasometer's ribcage suggests a sternum. A dome towers beyond low brick like a skull too proud to die. Rail lines braid into the promise of choke points and the threat of artillery maps already drawn. You are warned by the wind carrying the city's ash pile. The vestibule is empty. The house begins. On the forward slopes, the archetypes take stock between breaths. The community in steel tastes fatigue like a useful salt, but multiplies anyway. The judgment in steel rifles its last bell and holds its last thunderbolts for rooms that will insist on thunder. Sappers unroll a fresh white gospel of tape and teach the next lane to agree with existence. The defenders write in smaller handwriting and larger honesty. A chaplain becomes a medic because prayers without hands have lost their audience. A signaler coils a line he knows will not ring again, and carries it because carrying is also meaning. Afternoon does not culminate, it settles. A T-34 climbs into a cut on the ridge's back slope and looks down upon a road that is both a lifeline and a funeral procession. An IS-2 plants its tracks like pillars in a nave made of ruined trees and places a round into a truck that the world had asked to be brave for too long. The last well-sighted pack takes one more clean pound of flesh and is itself pinched between angles that do not permit integrity. A farmhouse that had played school for a platoon of gunners exhales its chairs and stops being furniture. The hammer no longer swings hard. It presses. Wood yields. Dusk arranges gun flashes into beads and hangs them across the eastern sky. No searchlights counterfeit the hour. The city provides its own penumbra. A low amber confession filtered through grim. The ridge reduced, shortened. Educated allows the last of its doctrine to pass downslope, like a rumor too tired to be malicious. The medium shapes overtake the old line and become silhouettes against a horizon their crews have dreamed in longer winters. The heavier shapes halt and listen to their barrels creak and cool, like old men whose shoulders remember exactly how much they lifted. Between them, infantry take breath in rooms they did not build and will not own. You are asked whether you can bear a victory that looks like this quiet, dirty, partial, inevitable. hardest virtue presence in alleys that will compress bravery into angles of pace. The IS-2 keeps its rare words for doors that meet their laws. Sapper's trade tape for ladders and chalk for chalk. 2 meters broad floors and flights of chalk. The defenders withdraw by streets that used to hold parades, and now hold sentences with no right of way. The city breathes them in and prepares to exhale. If you have followed this far, you know the lesson the Ridge refuses to memorize until it is too small to forget, that modern victory is carpentry disguised as thunder, that steel has archetypes, but men have hammers, that a hammer can knock and knock until the house must either open or fall. The Seelow Heights, Tudor and Threshold, have been argued into quiet, beyond them. Berlin begins, not as a myth, but as a neighborhood. Engines murmur, hands check bolts, boots shuffle